Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. It is always a pleasure to see you. We appreciate your taking time out of your busy schedule, and we realize that it was raining today. So thank you for those of you who had to walk through the rain to get here. Thanks for joining us. My name is Bronwyn Bruton. I am the Director of Programs and Studies and the Deputy Director of the Africa Center here at the Atlantic Council. I'm going to give a very brief introduction to the Africa Center since I see some new faces that I haven't seen before. The Africa Center was founded in 2009, almost exactly a decade ago, by former National Security Advisor General James Jones. And our mission is to promote dynamic geopolitical partnerships with African states and to shape U.S. and European policy priorities to strengthen security and promote economic growth and prosperity on the continent. Within the context of the broader Atlantic Council's work to promote constructive U.S. leadership and engagement in international affairs, the Center supports and collaborates with the public and private sectors in forging practical solutions to challenges and opportunities, particularly those that shape economic growth in Africa. Today, we're delighted to host a panel on barriers to women's access to credit in African markets, and I'm going to hand over to our senior fellow, Aubrey Hruby, who will introduce herself and manage the panel. Thank you, Aubrey.
Thank you, Bronwyn. Well, thanks everyone for coming out and for engaging in what we hope is a meaningful conversation today. And we really do hope it's engaging. And we have a small room, small group, so part of it is getting everyone's views and having some conversations. So it's really my pleasure to host this discussion. And to really dig deeper into some of the things that can be done to address gender equity issues in finance in African markets. We have been blessed with a lot of new data, not that we necessarily need it because there was a lot of old data that was very strong as well, but we have a lot of new data. The IFC published a very large report on gender issues in emerging markets when it comes to their funds, so private equity funds. And a couple of the key statistics that I think are relevant to this conversation is that only 10% of funds globally have women at a 30% threshold, so a gender balanced or gender diverse team at a 30% threshold. Only 10% of funds make that globally. In emerging markets, it's a bit higher, but that's at 20%. And in the African context, there's been efforts to dig deeper just to zero in on Africa, led by Private Equity Women's Investment Network, African Venture Capital Association, and CDC, which is the UK's DFI, the Development Finance Institution. And they found that only 6% of African funds meet even a 25% threshold, or 25% women. At a senior level. So there's a long way to go in terms of women being fund managers. And why this matters to women entrepreneurs is that when there's a woman on a decision making position with an investor, women entrepreneurs are twice as likely to get funded. So it matters for accessing growth capital to the entrepreneur to have more women who are fund managers. And so that's what we're going to have a conversation about today, is really what is preventing us from making progress in this area. So, and the initiatives that are underway and what we need to do together. So with that as kind of a preface, oh, nice to see this side of the room. So with that as a preface, I will have everyone introduce themselves and kind of say where they sit in the industry, and then have Katie chat a little bit about what OPIC's doing. So first we'll turn to Katie Kaufman, and then we'll come back to you on the whole 2X initiative.
Great, thank you so much. So first, thank you to the Atlantic Council for hosting this important discussion. Specifically, thanks to Aubrey. I don't think there is a more fierce fighter. I think fierce is absolutely the right word. Thank you so much for having us. My name is Kathryn Kaufman, and I'm the Managing Director for Global Women's Issues at the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which is the United States Development Finance Institution.
But before that, you were in the fund industry.
Before that, I was a partner in a venture capital firm, project development firm. I was the only female. Goes without saying, I guess.
Jake.
Hey everyone, I'm Jay Cusack. Thanks Aubrey for including me. So I'm managing partner at CrossBoundary, which is a frontier market investment advisory firm, and we also manage a couple investment vehicles. I think, and we'll probably touch on in the comments, I think we were not gender balanced when we started out. We were 100% male, and then we were 80% male for quite some time. But now I just actually looked again at because we just made a couple new hires yesterday. We've improved significantly the last few years. We are 26 females and 28 males. So I think roughly 47, 53%. And we can talk about some of the things that we did to try and to get to that level. It's only okay, I think, at the mid and senior level leadership. We have 2 of our 5 major offices are led by women. And that's something that we're working to improve as well. And I should also note that one of the reasons that we're here is we've done a lot of research in the last year around gender lens investing. And my 2 co-authors for an op-ed that we had in the Financial Times a couple of months ago on this topic were Celine Munier, who leads our Dubai office, and Tunica Gray, who's the deputy lead of our Nairobi office. And that op-ed, we can talk about it when it comes, but it's about this is not just the right thing to do, it's also the financially smart thing to do.
Yep. Great.
Great, thank you. My name is Berhane Demissie. I'm the managing partner at Cepheus Growth Capital Partners. But I'm happy to say we have 30% women in our team as well. And I think it wasn't something that we set out to do, but I think it was within our DNA of Cepheus that naturally we both look at, we all look at the gender angle naturally within our institution.
Well, it's obviously in your DNA because you're there.
Exactly.
I mean, as a partner. And I'm glad you bring up DNA because we can talk about 2X.
Yeah.
So about a year ago, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation launched its first ever women's initiative. And we branded it as 2X to represent, the slight nod to the female chromosome, but also to represent the multiplier effect of investing in women, that as a DFI, we expect for every dollar that we invest, our private sector partners will bring 2 with that dollar. We wanted to avoid another acronym in Washington. We wanted to make it easy for Republican men to talk about gender and women so they can just go forward with supporting 2X. And the purpose of 2X initially was to do the single largest financing commitment that the United States government has ever made to global women's empowerment. And that was a $1 billion commitment. So as a development finance institution, we came out publicly and said we would invest $1 billion in women-owned, women-led, and women-supporting enterprises in the emerging world. After we launched that publicly, we looked back at our previous year's portfolio, so 137 projects that OPIC had invested in. And of the 137 that had female ownership, any idea on what percentage or how many of those may have female ownership? 4. So we really made a big commitment with that $1 billion that we were supposed to deploy. And we engaged deeply in an exercise of counting. How many women can we invest in, and how much money can we get out the door? OPIC invests through 3 different product lines: structured finance, so basically debt, political risk insurance, and support to private equity funds. When we launched 2X within the agency, it was our private equity funds department that was knocking on my door saying, we really support you, we want to invest in women. They're not there, so good luck, and you can engage the rest of the agency. And it was a very tough conversation. Aubrey warned that she would actually just cut us off when we were rambling. Yeah. So I'll just say that this year we surpassed our $1 billion target. We've invested $1.4 billion in women-owned, led, and supporting enterprises around the world. We've engaged in gender lens investing training, and we have shifted our mindset at the agency from one of counting women to one of valuing women. So valuing them as entrepreneurs, valuing them as employees and leaders in enterprises, and valuing them as consumers, which I think is really important for the private equity side.
So maybe you can speak a little bit about 2X Africa. I think some of us followed the announcement. How is it different? How is it kind of manifest. I know that in Latin America, you've really pushed out a lot to credit, access to credit to women. So will 2X Africa be similar, or are there kind of sector focus, or are there anything that details you can give us today?
Sure. So 2X Africa, very importantly, is the same as 2X. What 2X has turned into is less of a counting and initiative and more of a way of business going forward, defining for capital markets broadly what it means to invest in women. So at OPIC, when we defined for ourselves what it would mean to invest in women and made our $1 billion commitment, we very quickly realized the magnitude of the opportunity and the limitations of our own agency. And we went around to our G7 sister development finance institutions and we asked them to join us. So when Canada held the...
When she said join, she means she challenged them and said, you better step up or you will be shamed in the world. And then they joined.
So in the spirit of the wonderful partnership that we have with our sister development finance institutions, and I really actually...
Yeah, they are great.
They are amazing, and they have pushed us to be better. We've really challenged each other. In Charlevoix in Canada, for the first time ever, the G7 came together for a common aim, which was women's empowerment, I think is a fantastic thing for the time. We spent 6 months as a G7, so we're talking about bringing together the views of Italy and the views of Japan and defining for us what it means to invest in women. We hired Dahlberg to make sure we were being evidence-based, and we wanted to really nudge our private sector partners to move in the right direction with us. What inspires me about this is that I think for the first time, we're really using systems of finance to create gender equitable change. And we're starting with the DFI community, which is, I think, where a lot of these cutting edge social innovations start. But we want it to be for capital markets broadly. We work with the private sector, and that's what we're really targeting.
But in the African context, the DFI community is not just there for, kind of the social aims of it. It is the core of the LP base for the investor base for African private equity funds. Most African private equity funds, the source of their money is the DFI community. So there's still a majority of the dollars that go to back private equity funds in Africa come from the DFI community. So they are very influential when it comes to shaping the financial landscape of African markets.
Exactly. So we actually play a really critical role, and our money comes with influence. So as a G7, we agreed to a definition. We committed to $3 billion collectively, and we committed to some basic tenets like we believe in best practices, transparency, accountability, all of these things that make us, frankly, like the reason we have a G7. And what we did is, as a group, start investing against this criteria and start pushing our private sector partners to value women the way that we were. So we're about a year into that partnership, and what we found is that we've been able to invest almost close to $1 billion. We're at 900 and something. You can go on our website. Everything's transparent and open, www.2xchallenge.org. And you can see where the dollars are going. Is it going to a woman-owned enterprise? Is it going to a financial intermediary? How are these dollars affecting women's lives? But the important piece on 2X Africa is it also shows a map. Where are those dollars going? Mm-hmm. In Latin America, we have over $300 million invested. In Asia Pacific, close to $400 million. In Africa, mind you, the continent with the largest amount of female entrepreneurs. Okay, this is our huge opportunity. 40 million. Mm-hmm. So we, just like we were leaving women out at OPIC because we weren't being intentional about investing with them, we're leaving Africa out because we're not being intentional about it. And so that is absolutely the way forward for us. And as Aubrey was just alluding to, we recently, our CEO and senior advisor to the president, Ivanka Trump, went to Addis and made $1 billion commitment to the women on the continent of Africa.
Fantastic. Well, one of the things I wanted to do in this conversation is kind of bucket the challenges we have, because I think almost everyone agrees that we know the destination, and it's for a gender balanced team. They have better returns. According to the IFC study, 20% better returns. But even more importantly, that came out of the IFC study was that and the CDC work, is that women not only get you better returns on the upside, but they're even more important on defending the downside, preventing the downside. So with funds that were gender balanced and they were poor performing for whatever reason, the benefit of women was a 50% improvement, because they, maybe this is the perception that they're more risk adverse, but they're helping to guard the downsides. So overall, the picture is one where the data is telling us, but yet we have challenges in executing. So one of the areas where I think we do have challenges is the recruitment and retention of more women in the space. And so maybe we can dig into that a little bit, because both Jake and Berhane, you mentioned recruiting and building the team. So maybe some of your experiences, Jake, on how you've gone to a gender balanced team. Obviously there's intentionality, as Katie's mentioned, but what other specific measures did you take?
Yeah, so I guess first of all, I think probably all of us believe that talent is evenly distributed and opportunity is not, which has implications for why this is a good asset class to invest in, because it's underpriced effectively. But also it means that if you don't have gender balanced teams, you're missing out on a lot of great talent. And I think the challenge is when you are initially a very male heavy firm, is that women look at your website and they can't see themselves fitting on that website. And so I think the first couple hires are really critical, and then they can be advocates and show the way for other women to join. And I think it's important to say that we did not set an artificial quota policy in the firm. The women that are at our firm were the best qualified people for that position. What changed was our funnel, so to speak, our access to talent and who was applying for those positions. And once we were able to change that funnel, we've been hiring majority women now for 2 years, because they are the most qualified applicants emerging from that process every time. And I think it's important that the firm knows that people at the firm know that nobody feels like they're here because of something other than being the most qualified person, because then that has implications for advancement. I think it can set a bad culture within the firm. And so I think where we think of quotas really is at the funnel, is are we getting enough applicants? We know they're out there. And it is a little bit easier at the junior level, because you do have these sort of hinge points where people are looking to make their next career decision. So you can recruit heavily right out of college. You can recruit heavily sort of 2 years in, when people have done their 2 years at Goldman or McKinsey and are looking to make a jump, and you can do it again at business school. And so that's an easier part to widen that funnel, and it can get more challenging when you're trying to hire directly for some of the mid and senior level leadership positions, because those people, particularly since they're all super qualified, might not necessarily actively be looking to make a change, and you have to go out and find them and recruit them and potentially convince them to join your organization from another one.
Yeah, and I guess you're a pretty young organization right now,
right.
Still. In the lifetime, I think one of the things that we see kind of statistically is that then there's also a drop-off, right? So when you have people on career trajectory promotion, and you have plenty of women at the junior level, that somehow there's still a funnel issue when it comes to senior, and that promotion issue around retention. And again, I think I am also with a young firm, so I don't see that as much, but I know larger organizations have that drop-off kind of period in mid-career.
Yeah, and I think, certainly we have many women at the firm right now who will make partner if they stay, and we want to do everything we can to keep them, and that figures into things like maternity leave policy, and do they feel like there's a good ramp to grow their family and grow their career at the same time.
I have to just say that the latest McKinsey report notes this drop-off, but attributes it not to women walking away. Women are staying, but they're not getting the promotions that they deserve.
Yeah, I think that's another issue with what type of work you get put on internally, and that's why I think having heads of offices and full-time work. But I don't know, Berhane, you've been recruiting specifically in Ethiopia.
Yes.
Do you feel that there's a different environment in that space, or what's it been like in terms of building your team?
Okay, like I said earlier on, we have 30% in our team, women. But one of the things that we focus on is when we do have intensive internship programs within our summer periods. And for those programs, we specifically look out for women, from graduate school or anything like that, to come and work with us for the summer internship, and we really give them exposure. It's not like they're there doing photocopying or anything, but they really tag along with the senior team members to actually get the experience, and they get the priority to come for the internship as well. So we're very actively engaged in getting that, and we're seeing that now. After 2 years of doing this, we're seeing more and more applicants from their own network coming back to us and saying, and our hope is after they finish their business school, they'll be coming to join the firm down the line. And the other key thing that we do is also getting engaged with the community, not only universities, but community business discussions within the country, to actually be there and represent what we do and about Cepheus, and really passing the information to the community so that they get engaged. Right. So it's a very active dialogue. But like you said earlier on, for retention, I totally understand the demands that we have at home and at work. So ability to create a conducive environment within the work office is very critical for women to be part of the organization. So, for example, if somebody needs to go and pick up their kids at certain specific hour in the afternoon, work around their individual need and work around their professional need, and really build the confidence within the company so that they belong and stay.
And what are you seeing in the portfolios company space? So the companies you're looking to invest in, I mean, how are you seeing the gender balance in those type of companies? Is it better, worse? And how do you see your role as an investor pushing that forward?
It's one of our key criteria when we do make investments. We do see women in the middle management level, and we want to put a lot more effort to provide training and grow the women in the leadership position within the companies, and also how they recruit. The biggest thing is the job description that you see in the market that really turns off a lot of applicants. So it's really, really critical for us to see women leadership in the companies, and also how they're recruited.
Yeah, I think one of the great powers of private equity, and one of the reasons why I'm so bullish on it as a development tool as well, is that once you're an investor in a company, you can push for a lot of change, right? If your investor tells you you need to have different policies, or you need to recruit differently, or think about your talent pool differently, that's going to be listened to. And you really do have a lot of sticks and carrots that you can push that rather than an outside discussion. So really, I believe that private equity has an ability to drive gender equity in markets. I don't know, Katie, when you're defining the broad category of women-owned, women-led, or women targeted, how do you think about post-investment as well? So once OPIC invests, one of the ideas I've heard recently is, okay, let's say there's a fundraising fund 3, right? But fund 1, they were all men. And then when the next round comes in, can you force a fund as they evolve to add more female partners? So that would be kind of getting a gender outcome, even though at the beginning they didn't look gender balanced.
Yeah, so can I just touch quickly on the influence that DFI capital and private equity has on its portfolio? I think it's really important for us in the way that we have communicated and applied a design think approach at 2X throughout OPIC, is that while the ESG side of the house is absolutely critical, and that has done a fantastic job of pushing enterprises in the right direction, it's a core tenet of what we do, our 2X team sits completely outside of that. We are a strategic asset to the agency for all of the amazing reasons that you all recognize and represent. Investing in women and valuing women is going to give you a better return. So all of 2X is about including a gender analysis into your financial analysis to get to a stronger IRR. So again, I think it's important that we are influencing our portfolios in the right direction, but it's important that we're influencing them in this direction to seize an opportunity, not as a you must do this or check the box. And then I think your follow-on question is basically, how are you doing that over time? Yeah. And what we have tried to do in that spirit is use this as a carrot and not a stick. So there's not going to be a default if you qualify for 2X and then something happens and you slip from the criteria. We will engage with you. We will help you keep that, and we will support you in your journey to ensure that both of our reputations remain intact and are moving forward in this regard. But we have simple things like you meet the 2X criteria, you're going to sign this letter, and then we check in over time and have the whole DFI process.
So I kind of want to switch to policy issues, and then we can also take some questions from the audience. But what can we do, given that we've had this data for 10 years, the numbers aren't exactly showing great progress. What can we do from a kind of policy perspective or intentional effort in the industry to make significant changes? So there was this week is the IFC and PIA conference. There was an active debate yesterday on quotas and whether there should be quotas or not. And the funny part is the audience voted, and the vote, I don't know if it was rigged or not, but it ended up 50-50, so neither won or lost on the quota debate. But one of the questions is quotas. Obviously, these are not either or questions either. It's probably and. But I know, Jake, you wrote a piece in the FT. Maybe you can talk through some of the ideas and suggestions you put forth and your team put forth for improving in this space.
Yeah. I mean, so I think quotas at the funnel is what we would say, not necessarily quotas
And the outcome.
at the outcome, because I do think that can create odd incentives. But I think to make sure that you are actively soliciting and targeting and going out and seeking to recruit female leaders, and the same thing when you're looking at investing in businesses. And I think, I mean, the data shows that women sometimes self-select out, basically, and so that means you do have to be targeted and perhaps do some calls that are specifically for women-led businesses, because they're going to be more apt to respond to that, because they might see a general call and think, oh, I'm not actually well suited for that opportunity. And there's a good example of a venture capital fund in Nigeria that did something like this, where they had a specific call for female-led firms, and they really didn't anticipate that much of a response. They sort of thought that they might end up allocating to maybe 3 companies, and they ended up doing 8 because they had an overwhelming response. I think, from a policy perspective, I think USAID and OPIC and others can put an emphasis on supporting first-time funds, which are more likely to have, or first-time funds that are being run or led by women, because there is a problem in the industry, right? So if you just kind of support the status quo, which is a bunch of male-led funds, that's a difficult dynamic to change.
Because you require, when people look to invest, they want a track record.
Right.
So if you haven't been in the industry, you don't have the track record. So then what happens is, for diverse funds are generally, and this is not just for gender diversity, but racial diversity, geographic diversity, they're generally going to be first-time funds because they don't have the track record. They weren't of the establishment before.
Right.
So that's the problem that Jake's speaking about. So trying to figure out what to do about helping first-time funds without a track record get access to the opportunity.
And finance is an apprentice-type business. Like, you're expected to pay your dues at each level, and then maybe once you've gone through every rank level, then you're 45 and you're allowed to go out and start to do your own fund. I think that's a fallacy overall. I think our fund, we hire much younger, flatter, and we do well because of that, because there's a lot of people, both men and women, who are kind of stuck feeling like they have to hit 15 wickets, whereas in actually the entrepreneurship world, being young is often seen as a positive. And so I think switching that balance a little bit, but then recognizing that, yes, first-time funds, particularly if they're being started by younger people who are not coming from the establishment, are going to need specific targeted support, because there is a lot of fixed costs that you have to try and undertake just to be properly set up and structured, know how to present yourself. And so I think having a policy or ways to provide support to kind of get them up on the same on a level playing field, so that their materials look just as good as the materials from the people who have been doing it for 15
And I see
years.
Berhane nodding, because Berhane, I mean, you've been fundraising, right?
Yes.
I mean, fundraising trek is a brutal one, and it's a first-time fund, though you've been in the industry before. And this is Fund 1 for Cepheus. So any ideas of how that process could have been improved, and what it's been like raising a fund as a woman and as a first-time fund?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really helped us that because the collective team had their own specific experience that added value to Cepheus. So I think the key thing, like Jake said now, is first-time fund. And so most investors would say it's a first-time fund, even though collectively we have significant experiences and we've known each other for quite a long time. So we thought that judgment was unfair for us. It's not. We didn't come together yesterday.
Yeah.
We bring a lot of value to the table, but it's a really a critical thing that everybody was asking. Oh, you're a first-time fund, but we say we're not really a first-time fund.
Right.
And but in the process, I think there's so many different ways that private equities negotiate with LPs and the legal docs and things like that. And people who haven't had that experience before, I think the biggest challenge is the LPA itself. How do we negotiate
So
with
this
LPs?
is the agreement that is structures between the private equity fund and the backer of the fund who's going to give the money. So that is a very legalistic process, lots of documents, and that agreement is one that's hard to navigate if you don't have experience in that before. You can sign a bad agreement or you can just not know what to ask for.
And so I hear that from people doing that for the first time. And the other one is really the financial burden that comes with fundraising.
Yes, absolutely.
It takes minimum 3 years to set up a fund. And during that time, you're focused day and night on making this fund work. So that means no other income. And when people have families and other responsibilities around them, facing that challenge, but every day getting up and making sure that you get to your at least first close is, I think, one of the difficult things, unless you have, like, within your team or within your partnership, somebody could, I was lucky enough to have that, but there are a lot of first-time funders who just give up halfway, and then they'll start doing consulting jobs and other jobs on the side to keep going, and then they lose the focus.
It's an expensive process, and it's a process where, for some reason, the way it's structured is that African fund managers tend to raise around certain conferences every year, and there's kind of a circuit. So imagine you're on this circuit going around meeting with the DFIs, like the OPIC and others. But then what happens is, for some reason, the people who are trying to raise the funds have to pay to go to the conferences, but the people who have the money already don't have to pay. So
exactly.
That's like a very interesting nugget, but it's representative of the whole thing. And so you're flying around doing this, and you're meeting with the same people. So I've put forth ideas, and I think many of us at this table and in this room have, on how that fundraising process could be improved and streamlined. One that that's more radical is that, could an OPIC, the DFC of the future, so the Development Finance Corporation, the new expanded OPIC, almost act like American Idol for fund managers? And the way that Simon Cowell would sit there and basically put a band together, right? So you see two people raising this type of fund over here. You see two people raising on this fund. Maybe this is a woman who's struggling for various reasons. These are the two guys with traditional track record. Could you kind of push them together and say, we'll back this combined thing? So make these kind of stellar bands. From panel type discussions. So I think we have to get experimental in how we improve this process, because it really does push women out.
Yeah, I think just to build on that idea, and something that we've suggested is basically hosting, something like on the order of a boot camp or something like that. That would be, help. And Capria does something similar for some first-time funds, but have it specifically targeted around women-led funds, and providing, coaching and a lot of these basic things that people end up having to pay a lot of money for, like your legal documents. Minimum just to get the first drafts that you're working with often can be $500,000.
Yeah.
But they're all pretty similar documents, and so that cost can be shared and then socialized against a much wider pool. And having an event or a pitch session or a couple-day pitch sessions where the DFIs are sort of coming to them, as opposed to asking women potentially on very limited budgets to fly all over the world from Ghana or Nigeria or Ivory Coast to go individually.
Yeah,
pitch.
I think one of the initiatives we're piloting, so I'm part of something called Private Equity Women's Investment Network, and PEWIN is doing something called Project Pink Light, whereby they're allowing women fund managers to kind of do their pitches, but with an all-women panel that are kind of CIO types, who can give chief investment officer types, who can give them candid feedback in a very non-pressurized environment. So they can kind of do these trial runs of pitching to potential LPs. And that's gone fairly well so far. And that's that kind of coaching early. But it's also changing the environment a little bit so that it's among friends, it's candid, it's coaching rather than, and getting candid feedback. So I think there are little few efforts like that, but they're not necessarily being pushed through like a DFI, the DFI system like 2X Challenge is, right? And I think given that you have the 2X Challenge, you can build a lot on that platform.
And now we know why Aubrey invited me to be on this panel.
No,
These are really great ideas. And I actually, just quickly, we launched something called Fund Mujer in Latin America, which was intended to support fund managers that valued women in their portfolio companies. And we had amazing applications come in, some of them in the VC, where OPIC is not expert in investing in that asset class. So we met with those fund managers and had similar conversations where she's like, I just can't fly all over the world to pitch you guys, you know? So I think it's a great idea and something that we will work on.
So do we have any questions for the audience at this point, or ideas on how to kind of push this forward? We'll take a couple and engage in the conversation, please. If you could identify yourself.
Former State Department.
Okay.
I have a question for Kathryn. Given the intentionality of the initiative, really reaching out, also working with you're coordinating with USAID. I just wanted to ask, are you also coordinating with our agencies where presenting public diplomacy sessions are developing these relationships with women and private players? Also, our officers can be that first point of contact. Also, how are you working with the NGOs that have the long-standing relationships with women, women entrepreneurs, like CARE, for example?
Are there any other questions? We'll take a group, please, in the back.
Thank you for your comments, everyone. Heather with Village Capital. My question, so I agree that there's a lot of work to do in creating a more diverse pool of capital providers. But I'm curious about what strategies you've seen that have worked to actually support the diverse pool of pipeline, so actually support the early stage pipeline of female-led ventures.
So the entrepreneur side of it. Please, here.
Christina Hardaway, State Department as well, on detail at the U.S. African Development Foundation. So since this panel was specifically about African entrepreneurs, African women entrepreneurs, and you identified the huge disparity between investments in other regions of the world focused on women, can you speak to what exactly is the issue in Africa why this disparity exists? Like what is the difference between African women and women in Latin America or other regions of the world?
Yep. Okay, any last questions for this round? Yes, great.
I just had a quick question. I was just curious with regards to that initial 2X commitment from OPIC. I think you said all of the data is public on the website, but it would be interesting to hear, I think, like the $1.4 billion, roughly how that was divided between, I forgot what the three buckets you had mentioned were, but like project finance or whatever that bucket was, funds and direct investments.
What was your name?
Oh, I'm Dan Block with Global Innovation Fund.
Yeah, great. All right, let's take this group of questions. Maybe we'll start first with Katie on how the embassies and you engage with its state, because I know it's also a larger question of the DFC and going forward with OPIC.
Yes, thank you so much, Eunice. Thank you for your public service. We work very closely with our counterparts at USAID. As you may be aware, with the passage of the BUILD Act, there's actually a piece of USAID that is coming over to OPIC. It's called the Development Credit Authority, and they're going to help us coordinate better with their offices on the ground. OPIC is an amazing institution. We do great work all over the world. In covering the world, I think we may have 2 or 3 people outside of Washington, D.C. So we really need the support of the embassies, particularly as the BUILD Act also pushes us to the lower income countries, and it also pushes us to make higher impact investments. So it's people in the embassies, people at USAID on the ground that can help develop that pipeline, and we're right now working on a strategy on how we better utilize our assets on the ground and better coordinate. I also wanted to touch, you asked about the NGO world, and my personal background, I went from defense policy at the Pentagon to venture capital to gender in a DFI. So I am gaining experience on understanding the gender community, but I rely so heavily on the experts and the activists in this town. there's an organization called the Coalition of Women's Economic Empowerment, CWE, and they've organized themselves as an advocacy group. I have asked them to serve as an advisory committee to the 2X team. We meet with them regularly. They hold us accountable. They will write an op-ed if we're doing something they don't agree. That we have an incredible relationship, and I am so grateful to the NGO community for getting me smart.
Yeah, maybe Berhane, you could take the question on pipeline and how what do you think female entrepreneurs in a market like Ethiopia need that's not in the market right now, or how can we get more of them in the early stage pipeline?
I think the key things, first of all, in a market like Ethiopia, private equity is very nascent. So I think it's just not only with women, but general entrepreneurship community. We're always spending time introducing the asset class to the community. So it's not a developed asset class. But for example, within Cepheus, we're targeting 30% of our fund to be invested in women-owned businesses. So to do that, we have to go one step further of really reaching out and finding out through our research and analytics unit to say which women are operating what sector, and then really go to them and then help them if they need it to get them ready for investment. So working with them, even though their businesses are doing okay, but getting them the process of them coming to private equity and being able to be investable. It could be documentation, it could be putting together the financials the way we want to see it and things like that. So we go the extra step to make sure that we reach out.
Are there organizations, or for example, in the venture capital space, there's always these incubators or accelerators. Are there organizations that are doing that in Ethiopia, or do you think there's a gap for this kind of services provided to entrepreneurs?
There's a number of incubators within the country, but I think what we lack is intermediaries, or like people who, like the legal system supporting entrepreneurs to come to private equity, and the other services of packaging them to come to private equity. So we have to do that step as well for some entrepreneurs to make sure that they're at an investable stage.
Yeah, I had an interesting conversation the other day with a guy out of Dubai who's Egyptian, and he's a lawyer, and they've created a product for entrepreneurs that instead of you paying your lawyers by the hour, which I think all of us have experienced the joy of that, where suddenly a phone call that started out like, how you doing? And all of a sudden you're like, whoa, how much did that phone call cost me? But to pay by product, and it's like templatized product, and it's growing super fast in Egypt. In fact, they have almost the entire entrepreneurial ecosystem. And I think those are maybe something like that could help solve some of those problems for support for entrepreneurs writ large, as you said. And Jake, I know you guys done a lot of work in Mali and the investment landscape in Mali. I mean, how is the Mali market for thinking about this issue in terms of pipeline and women? Yeah,
I mean, I think, and maybe this touches your question on some of the challenges in Africa generally. So we talked about how in sourcing and selection you need to have this really proactive effort. You also need to be sensitive to some of the cultural or religious context and what kind of events and other things make it easy for women to meet investors. For instance, if you have an event that's just sort of a big evening drinks event, that women might not feel comfortable coming that alone, particularly given given the state of the industry. It's going to be a male-dominated event, and so making sure that there's forms and ways for women to meet with investors, as part of more of their normal daily routine, I think is important. I think that the second stage is once you have identified women to invest in again, the data shows that women are generally more cautious. They ask for less money. Men generally ask for too much money. Men are more willing to take equity and take on riskier structures and things like that. And so adapting the instrument of the investment, whether it's convertible debt or revenue sharing, things that are understandable, that can meet the desire to be more cautious, that can be tranched out perhaps as opposed to in one lump sum. And this is interesting. I mean, this is even an issue in the U.S.
Oh, totally.
One of my best friends from business school was this woman, Katrina Lake, and she started this company called Stitch Fix, and she really struggled at every turn basically to raise capital, resulting in her driving the business to profitability earlier then perhaps like would have been your optimum growth trajectory because she just didn't want to raise anymore. But then she became the youngest female founder in history to take a company public. And so I do think you're seeing evidence like that in the market where investors are like, this is actually like setting aside that this is the right thing to do. I'm missing out on opportunities if I'm not meeting these people where they're at and providing appropriately tailored investment instruments.
I think there's some innovation happening in the product design phase for gender product design. I mean, you even see it with in the US with like women's 401ks, because women tend to outlive men on average by 8 to 10 years. So they have to have longer saving periods. They peak on their incomes earlier, so you have to save earlier. So these type of product innovations that might fit. To your question on the data on why Africa has been a little bit lower and bringing down the average in terms of the like IFC study, et cetera. One, I would say we don't necessarily know all the answers yet. In fact, the effort that I have been involved in to look at the data from an Africa lens specifically through the African Venture Capital Association and CDC showed that within CDC's portfolio, and they're one of the largest investors in African private equity funds, there wasn't a single West African fund that had a female partner. And that's odd in my gut, because my experiences in Nigeria and other places showed that there's a lot of women in finance, but for some reason they're not in the private equity element of finance, right? They're in banking maybe, or other parts. So the question, we just have to dig deeper, and we don't know the answer. We can say that in Southern Africa, so again, I don't want to take Africa as a uniform place, because there's actually sub-regional diversity in the outcome as well. In Southern Africa, we've seen a lot of improvement, but that's because it's been legislated, because it's been part of the Black economic empowerment, now has an aspect of women in that. And because of that, you see a lot of improvements of funds having female partners in South Africa. But part of it is that they have to in order to get money from PIC and some of the South African investors. So it's a varied landscape, and I'm not sure we know the answer on what it's going to take or the specific issues. We're just beginning to look at that level.
Can I ask the audience a question?
Well, for sure, and we did have his question about the
about where it's dividing up in the different business lines.
Did you convince the fund department to get?
Oh, of course, it's incredible. Guess what? We're 51% of the population. We exist, and we are valuable producers in the fund management world, and also as consumers. We make 70 to 80% of all consumer decision making around the world. It's like $20 trillion of consumer spending that if you are at the portfolio level and aren't understanding your customer base, you're missing a huge opportunity. So I do believe once we were intentional about it, once we changed our unconscious bias lens and pushed some of our existing clients to see the world that we now see it, they've made some shifts themselves.
But can you say, like, for example, the 1.3 billion, like 900 million was pushed out through funds, this was pushed out through debt, this was pushed out through...
Yep, I'm going to get it.
Yeah.
I'm going to get it wrong, but it's pretty evenly broken up among the business lines. If you look at OPIC's portfolio, our single largest sector is energy. That's the single least diverse sector for gender. The second for us is financial services. We've made an approach that we won't do another financial services deal unless it meets our 2X requirements. It's so important to us to go. There's a $300 billion access to credit gap. That's not going to change because of OPIC's $1 billion commitment. The way it is going to change is when we work with our commercial financial institutions on the ground, we're actually asking them to change the way they do business going forward. Mm-hmm. It takes a long time to go through it all, but I think that we have successfully integrated 2X throughout all of our business lines.
Sure, so now we can ask the audience questions. This is like a fun reversal of the space. I mean, I can definitely call on some key people to get some insights as well, but feel free.
Well, or the panel. I'm just interested. So Aubrey really challenged me over a cocktail once. You know, what about this quota? Why won't OPIC say we will not invest in a fund manager that is all male? And of course, I'm like, I don't know. It sounds great to me. I mean, we know we'll get higher returns. We actually know we'll get better returns if we do that. But I'm also not a quota person.
Yeah.
And I really believe in the opportunity that this needs to be presented as. I have seen, since we have launched the 2X Challenge and the probably $1 trillion that the G7 represents from a DFI space, I have seen clients constantly come in and say, oh no, we're applying for OPIC, but we're bringing on a new partner, it's a woman. You know, I think that just stating that we value this, stating that it's important to us is changing behavior. Am I being really optimistic because I'm sitting in my little 2X bubble and I'm, you know, congratulating ourselves?
That's her question to the,
I have a personal experience about that. About 3 years ago, before starting Cepheus, when we were with Cassie, when we were thinking about what we want to do next, I actually got approached by a West African fund to join their GP. They offered me partnership, stake, and all that, just because all the LPs are asking them to have a woman partner. I have no idea about West Africa. I don't know what to do, but they needed to check the box. So actually, I didn't like it, the fact that they asked me just because, not the value that I bring, just because they needed to take the box, check the box, and then present to the LPs that they have diversity. So it's a very interesting question at that time.
Yeah.
Yeah, just a quick comment on that is there is sometimes, I mean, I generally think, actually, I think your optimism is actually well placed, but I do think that there is danger sometimes, you know, people latch onto whatever seems to be like the flavor of the moment that will lead to subsidized funding, essentially, and particularly that's the case here in DC. You hear, you know, when Power Africa got announced, suddenly there was a lot of people with business cards that had something tied to energy in Africa, you know, showing up these things, and so I think that is something to manage, and I think it is important that it's not, this check the box mentality. And I got some interesting feedback internally recently from an African woman on my team, which I think ties into this a little bit, which is she said, you're too easy on the women at the firm, basically. Like you're much more likely to give strong negative feedback to the men, and that feels to you like you're being nice, but you're actually doing a disservice because you're not providing them with that feedback that people need to grow and thrive, which I thought was a really good point, because it is sometimes tough for me. Like I tread very cautiously in those conversations, whereas if it's a white male, I feel, you know, it's very easy for me to give that harsh feedback. But that was sort of an interesting, you know, color on that point, is that it can't be a mentality of like, this person's in this role because I need to have this, you know, great composition.
But it's good to talk about these things, because I've had it the other way. I've worked my entire career for amazing female bosses, right? And what I can say is that a lot of my female bosses were way harder on the women. And the women were, for example, they stayed later, they did all these things, and they ended up like doing twice as much work, and the guys would be like, I have to go. And then somehow like that would work out that way. And so maybe it's just where your comfort zone is in that space. And I think it could be, it could go on either side. But, you know, I see Kate in the audience. You said energy is one of the least diverse spaces. Maybe you could speak a little bit, because your firm is leading hard on the women's side.
Yeah, we're getting more balanced now. We've hired 3 men. Yeah, I think this is a great topic, and thanks to everyone for sharing your experiences. We were actually talking about the quotas before this started because of the MPEA vote yesterday and where that ended up. I would say firmly no on the quotas, just because I think there is so much bias built into it, that I got invited to speak at something, and the invite was, could you do this? We really need a woman on the panel.
Yeah, I've had that.
And I wrote back and said, I'm not available, but the appropriate question was, can you speak on this? You're an expert in the field. Which hopefully was enough to shame him into never doing that again.
That's why we have Jacob.
Yes, exactly. But I do think it's a good question, because we were talking about our company started with 4 women, and we started with 2, but then our next 2 hires were women, both in scientific fields. We actively tried to hire a man for the 4th, but the most qualified happened to be female. We have since then diversified a little bit, but only have 1 man on our board. And we've talked about, is this are we causing the same problem where we're not gender diverse? And if we're truly committed to gender diversity, we need to actively recruit a gender balanced board, a gender balanced company, so that we don't end up with 80% women at some point. So I think it's something that everyone needs to be conscious of, and everyone needs to be aware of their biases as they're starting to build up the teams.
But in the industry, you're still fighting against a big
Oh yeah. So I think energy is tough. I think that it's getting better. I would say same as everything else. As you see more and more STEM graduates coming out, more and more engineering graduates, schools that are really emphasizing women's education in those fields. I think I'm very optimistic about where it ends up. I think on the continent, with working with African utilities, working with African energy leaders, there's still a lot of work to be done as well. But also you're seeing a rising generation of really dynamic women who are starting to lead in that field. So I think I sit in a very optimistic place on that as well.
Good. Well, I'm going to call on Bruce in the field. You work a lot in African media. So maybe your thoughts on the media space and what it looks like.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's great to be here and listen in. I appreciate the invitation. Sort of a fly on the wall in the conversation, appreciating the dynamics that are taking place. With respect to media in Africa, having sustainable businesses is difficult to begin with, and if you're female-owned, that may add to the complexity. But I'd be interested in your thoughts if you come across, in fact, media enterprises that are owned by women that are at the stage to take investment. So it's a big challenge. I would just add that yesterday I worked with the Peace Tech Lab at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and we had a program yesterday looking at the need for research across the continent of Africa. And we spent a half a day talking about the difficulties, the pressures that media in Africa are under right now because of difficult business models and also rising censorship. So when we take a look at women-owned media enterprises in Africa, they face all these challenges as well, in addition to the gender challenges. So I'd just be interested if you, and particularly in Mali, have you come across any circumstances, any instances where there might be an enterprise owned by women and media operators that's worthy of investment?
You get a really small Venn diagram there.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. In Mali specifically, in media, I'm not sure. Most of our work there has actually been with agribusinesses. I do think the media sector is a challenging one right now. Generally, so my only observation would be is that I think there are certain opportunities and distribution channels and customer, segmentation channels that women are much more likely to pick up on and be aware of, and that creates opportunities. And you've seen that in the U.S. with the success of a number of women-led and women-backed firms that are reaching the customer in a way that just the white male venture capitalist doesn't really get. And I think there's the same opportunities in Africa, whether it's a subscription-based model for having access to fashion or some innovation around the space of how are you reaching that customer.
Right. Do we have another round of please?
I think I just want to add on to the comment.
Can you say your name?
Sorry, I'm Martha. I work with Jake at CrossBoundary. I just came back from the DRC, and one of the entrepreneurs we met was a lady who had a media and advertising company, but she had to close it down, I think, after 5 years and went into other ventures. And she said something that was really interesting to me. She was doing really well for the first 3 years, but then the people she was working with realized, this is a woman, probably someone who's a bit softer, and started asking her to pre-finance their ventures, and then they would pay her back later. And they just never paid her back on time. So I think it goes back to the whole thing of you have to have women in power, otherwise you have a guy who's trying to work with this lady and he's just thinking, I can take advantage of her, why not do it? Just something.
Do we have any other questions on this?
Can I have one more comment?
Yeah, no,
I'm
for
sorry.
sure. We have
I
lots
just,
to-
an interesting anecdote. I am optimistic, and I love it that sort of people feel optimistic along the same lines. But the data is so stubborn. It's so incredibly stubborn, and the areas where we are actually regressing in terms of participation in the C-suite in this country, Fortune 500s in this country. And the World Economic Forum, when they keep stacking the 100 years until we see relative parity, it's just overwhelming. And at the same time, 1 in 3 of us are getting beat up or raped.
Yeah.
It becomes just frustrating, is an easy way to put it. But when there does feel like there's this momentum, and Aubrey and I were at Milken a few weeks ago, and I happened to share a taxi to the airport from, probably shouldn't say where he's from, but a very senior person at a bulge bracket bank. And I said, did you enjoy milk? And he said, yes, I went to a topic on the masculinity in America. And I said, oh, how interesting, did you enjoy it? And he had no idea what I do or who I am. And he was like, yeah, I had to go to that because I have a son and he has a target on his back. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. We're the ones getting beat up. Tell me about that, especially your rich white son that goes to boarding school. Like, I think he's gonna be okay, but I'm concerned as well. And I just think that we need to start changing the way we talk about these things. I mean, I'm so impressed by Jake's comments and how he's approached it. I'm writing notes and we'll read your article. That's how we have to start talking about it, and we have to be more inclusive. For whatever reason, I don't think that's a one-off anecdote, the target on the back. And I just wanted to share that and say, for those of us that are sitting on the stage that are women, or those of us that care about this topic, I hope that we're cognizant of that and always talking about it not as a zero-sum game. There is no women get better, so men are going to have to, turn back. We're all going to rise. It's all positive, and we actually need men to kind of like help with this wave.
Yes, she wants to comment.
Hello, my name is Nayeli Dominguez, and I've actually been an outlier often in non-traditional fields. So in undergrad, I was an engineering student, and then I graduated with my engineering degree. Then I went into consulting, and now I'm a law student. So I've always been in fields that are very highly not represented in women fields, but from that aspect, and just, I guess, in terms of diversifying these areas where I've often been heavily unrepresented. Like, for example, my parents didn't go to high school. I kind of charted the way through, and I'm also a first-generation American. What are we doing around the conversation, though, to raise young girls and have them build those skills early on? Because I feel like a lot of these conversations are circled around what women are already available to fill these spots that we need. But what are we doing, I guess, from the bigger perspective to ensure that we bridge that gap access to build those entrepreneurs with better skills, so when they come to the table, one, they feel like they have a voice at the table, because we all know they have a voice, they just need the microphone. But how do we feel, or what are we doing to equip them better, but from that pipeline as small girls, and ensuring that we raise them up?
Yeah, I mean, I think we could have a million hours that we need to dedicate to solving, that challenge. But one thing I'll zoom in on is that at one point I had ideas of doing a PhD in economics, and one of the goals I had was to try to measure the economic value of a role model, because I think it's huge. It really is absolutely something that, like, there's just no words for it. And I think of a story of a friend of mine who's Senegalese and married to a Nigerian, and they have a daughter. And she was watching something on the White House when some event at the Rose Garden on TV when Obama was president. And it was an event where the other presidents came and they were there. So George W. Bush and Clinton, they were all there. And so she's 8 years old, and she asked her dad, well, who are those other guys? And so then he said, of course, oh, those are former presidents, blah, blah. She said, oh, white guys could be president? And because in her life, only Obama, right? And I think those type of things really shape your thinking. And in the African context, one of the things I've been proud to see over the last 15 years is that for 40 plus, the only way to get to power, influence, prestige was through government in a lot of places on the continent. And so young kids dreamed of being minister or getting appointment. And what we've seen is a rise of a vibrant private sector where young kids can be like, I want to be like Dan Gote, or I want to be like Chris Karubi, or whoever it is. Now and obviously that's a small group of powerful business people, and it's not diverse from a gender perspective at all, but it's given another whole way of life idea to someone. So I think the power of role models, we just don't even understand the economic value of it, because that economic value of inspiration and hard work is just unbelievable. And anyway, so for me, I think it's partly that, and having the role models. But I know that you, Berhane, we're talking about, just introducing women to the field that you're in, even as something you have to do in early stage giving back efforts.
Yeah, absolutely, especially with young graduates. But we had discussion before with when EIB came to Ethiopia, they had a gender-focused discussion. And what came out was that we have to start as early as, 7, 8 with the girls to actually get them to understand they can do what others can do, like building the confidence, introducing them to the private sector, and really building on their ambition at a very, very young, early age, and keep doing that, over the years until they get into the working world. But from university perspective, as being engaged while women are in universities, I think is very, very critical, so that even having the mindset of that I can do it, there's nothing to stop me, and I can do it as much as the men can do it, I think is very, very critical.
Yeah.
Also, there's a woman here in the audience from the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Yes. She may want to comment on just the various systems. There are over 100 countries with laws that tell women where they can and can't work. Yeah. And so we have systems of laws, systems of education, systems of finance, systems of media. How are each of us pushing these systems to create the gender equitable world we need?
Well, hi, my name is Kathryn O'Neill. My name is Kathryn O'Neill. I'm an attorney at the Millennium Challenge Corporation. And one of my clients is the gender group. And actually, before I joined MCC, we did a project in Lesotho where we did legal reform to make women be considered adults.
Real people.
I think in
some
adults.
Yeah.
Adults. That was before my time, but I heard about the project.
I was involved at that point. So yes.
Okay. So we don't do that much legal reform on gender, but that's an example of something that can happen. And I did one of the projects that I worked on when I first joined MCC was drafting our anti-sexual harassment guidance for the field operations. And so what we basically did, the way we crafted it was we had a closed session with our counterparts who were the gender experts on our projects all around the world, and locked the door and said, what are you seeing in your offices? Not just in the countries, but in the offices that we're funding, right? Who's getting chased around the desk, who's not getting a promotion, and are the people who are witnessing it, are they also getting in trouble for coming forward? And it was really interesting just to hear what people said. So we crafted the guidance based on what people were really seeing in their offices. And in some cases, I made sure to put things on LGBT without saying LGBT, because we're dealing with countries where we would never say such a thing. But I made sure to put provisions in there talking about no discrimination based on nonconformity with gender roles, because that cuts a lot of different ways. So I think there's all kinds. There's so many fronts because there's so many problems. There's so many ways for us to effect change. And one thing, since I have the mic, I do this in groups randomly, and it's not on point. But if you can mentor, to your point and to your point, if you can mentor a young person, I think it can really have a big result in ways that you could never imagine just by being you. I helped my mentee. She applied to law school at a perfectly respectable law school, and she said, "Okay, I'm done." And I said, "No, you're not." Mm-hmm. And I helped her with her applications, and she ended up going to an Ivy League law school. That doesn't mean she's smarter than other people, doesn't mean she's better than other people, but it means that she has that, right? So if there's ways that we can always open the door for the person behind us, lend a hand, think about ways that you can do that in your life, whether it's professional or just, however else.
Yeah.
That's sorry.
Listen, I think it's great to kind of wrap up on a local versus global. There's things we do on the policy level, and then we do in our own lives. And Berhane wants to say something on that.
It's just a saying, because I have my Ethiopian brothers and sisters here.
Yes.
We have a saying in Ethiopia, like Setigdali, it means let a woman kill me. if she kills me, she'll do it well.
I mean, I don't know if we want to be murderous, but at different times.
But it means that whatever they do,
I love it.
They'll do it well.
You know, and I think all of us are treading very interesting times with the optimism in the face of overwhelming data. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to find ways to dramatically push for change, or radically in my view, but then also do that in a way that doesn't create other problems that we have to unsort later, right? And I think some of the challenge of the conversation around getting gender balance is, you know, being construed as like some terrible political correctness that then a populism wave is pushing against. And so I think we have to figure out a way to do that radical kind of change, but either overcome the populism or find a way that it makes it not be easily brushed aside as like political correctness. And unfortunately, the data is not enough, because we've had the data for a long time. We continue to have the data, and we'll get even more data, but I'm not sure just the data argument is enough. So, you know, I think we'll just depend on the day how you feel on the optimism versus the overwhelming challenge. But really, thank you everyone for joining our conversation today. Thanks for everyone who watched it. I know that we got some messages from folks in Nigeria who couldn't come, who wanted to be involved. So we streamed it anyway. So thanks everyone, and join me in thanking the panel.